Great. Well, that's it, everybody. We are now live. Over to you, Katie.
Brilliant. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I hope those of you that have been to various events this morning have been suitably inspired and are looking forward to what this afternoon has in store. My name is Katie. As Amy just said, I'm a teacher at Wellington College, and I have the absolute pleasure of introducing one of my colleagues and our next speaker. This is Mr. David Edwards. So despite having no previous rowing experience, David, along with 4 teammates, took on the fairly unenviable challenge, I think, of rowing 3,000 miles from the Canary Islands to Antigua across the Atlantic Ocean. So with an amazing story of perseverance, resilience, bravery, teamwork, and possibly 1 or 2 hair-raising moments as well, David, all told with his typical good humour. Please give a warm virtual round of applause to Mr. David Edwards. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Katie. It's a real a treat, really, to be able to speak to you all today about our little adventure. I'm going to talk a little bit about the reasons why I wanted to do it in the first place, but there's an awful lot in it about, I don't know, self-reflection, teamwork, and all of that sort of thing. It is an old classic adventure. The fact that we rode the Atlantic isn't going to change the world or anything. I mean, having just listened to Hamzy, who is just incredible and one of lots of people who are actually going out there changing the world, I mean, it does really pale into insignificance as an achievement, but we can't change the world on our own. We need to be able to operate within teams to magnify our impact. And this gave me the opportunity for over 41 days just to examine myself, examine my role within a team, how I functioned, how that impacted on others, but also how their demeanor, their character, their way of working impacted on me. So just to introduce you to the cast, you can see the picture in front of you. That's me on the left with the kind of visor thing on. You can't see Ian, who's on the first oar. There you've got Waddy. So Ian is an entrepreneur. Waddy, the first guy you can see, he's a bomb disposal expert. Julian is next along, also rowing, and he was my boss at the time. And DJ, standing up, looking heroic. He is also another bomb disposal expert. We'll talk a little bit more about those shortly. But we learned an awful lot during the course of the row, and these were the big lessons that I learned for me. I was very, and the tick or the cross next to them is whether we passed or failed them. I was very, very bad about worrying things I couldn't control, like wind and tides. They stressed me out. We wanted to get across quickly, and things like weather forecasts or tides, they would slow us down, and that would stress me out. And I was very bad at managing my reaction to that. We put a team together to do a job, and as much by accident as by design, we ended up having shared values and goals, and that would be an absolute prerequisite for me for putting a team together in the future. We couldn't go anywhere for 41 days. We were on that little boat, and we needed to be really careful with our relationships. We need to handle them carefully and manage our reaction to stuff. We also needed to keep things in perspective. Whenever there was a temptation to fall out over something, you just needed to remember where you were and what you were doing and how simple life was on a boat. There's only a finite load of stuff to do over and over again. And to have a big row about something that's pretty simple, I think would have been a failure of character on our part. And although there's not a lot of tech on board, you've got to be pretty skilled in managing stuff like solar energy, and the navigation equipment, the comms. And through a lack of experience, really, we didn't do that very well. And so I think more preparation would have enabled us to put a green tick where that red cross currently is. I'm just going to talk a little bit about why rowing the Atlantic, because it's only really by being out on the Atlantic that I'm able to tell this story. So I might as well tell you why I did it. And like loads of young people, when you're kind of 8, 9, you get inspired by things that you see, things that you read, or conversations that you had. And when I was about 8, I read the story about the French doctor Alain Bombard, who it was in 1953. He had this theory that people were not surviving shipwrecks at sea due to a kind of failure of the mind as much as anything, that they felt they were doomed, so they gave up, so they died. And he wanted to set out to prove that you could spend much, much longer at sea with minimal resources and still survive. So he took himself off in this rubber dinghy and made his way across the Atlantic, drinking rainwater and eating plankton. He arrived in a shocking state in the Caribbean, but he proved his point. And I found that story absolutely captivating, in the same way that Scott and the South Pole had captivated me, and Everest, all of these things that just open your eyes to the things you can do with your life if you put your mind to it. And that really just planted the seed, I think, in my mind. A little bit later on, these guys, Fogle and Cracknell, had a TV series where they documented their journey across the Atlantic, the same route that we did. And I quite like Fogle's quote there. It's just about making the most of your life, and you only live once. You only get one crack at this, and if there's something that you want to do, you should probably find a way to do it. And that was another nudge to me that perhaps I could do this. There might be a time or an opportunity, but then life gets in the way. You get married, you have kids, and then your dream seems to go a little bit further away. And then we did decide to do it. So what started off as a really childish ambition did come to pass. But by this point, now I was 44, 45 when I did this. Adventure and challenge served a different purpose. It was, I think, quite tightly linked to my self-esteem. And from a relatively young age, I've run marathons, I've had adventures, because I feel that they've played quite an important part in ensuring me against the lack of self-esteem. And it was actually just last night I found this quote actually from Seligman: feelings of self-esteem in particular and happiness in general develop as side effects of mastering challenges, working successfully, overcoming frustration and boredom, and winning. The feeling of self-esteem is a bright byproduct of doing well. And there are many, many opportunities to do well in life. And for me, these sorts of adventures, I think, tick that particular box. But you don't have to climb mountains, go to the South Pole, or anything like that. The challenges that feed into our well-being and our self-esteem, I think they're all around us every day. And while it's wonderful to have the opportunity to climb a mountain or row an ocean, these challenges, these things that are difficult, these things that take us out of our comfort zone, that contribute to our self-esteem and sense of well-being, they're around us every day. For example, speaking out, having the courage to call someone out when they're wrong, and being true to your values, not following the crowd, working hard, stuff like that. And the project that a lot of you have been involved in, the Social Leaders Project, that's an example of how you can do things that other people who aren't as motivated to do stuff as you can do those things, and it's good for you. But I think at school in particular, we should be seeking out and practicing challenge in what's a relatively low stakes environment, so that when we go into the real world, when we go into a higher stakes environment, we're practiced at risk taking, risk assessing, and actually having the courage to do the thing that we want to do. And the little picture in the corner there is most of these things I apply the rocking chair test to, that when I'm like that guy and I'm in my rocking chair with my blanket, am I happy with the life I've lived? Have I used my body and my mind to the maximum? And I just want to be able to rock there happy in the knowledge that I did. And the Atlantic row is kind of, it's one of those things that for me passes my rocking chair test. The great thing about the Atlantic row is that it requires almost no technical ability, there's no physical barrier to you getting the job done. As you can see from that slide, in the top left, a team of amputees rowed it 5 5 or 6 years ago. You've got people of all shapes, sizes. Mo there, she's 64 years old, a deaf lady. Anyone can row the Atlantic. And this is, I'm not a climber. I haven't got any practical, technical ability. And yet this was an adventure that was available to be done, and and that's really why it came into consideration, added to the fact that I'd always wanted to do it. I knew it could be done. I'm a father of 4. You can see them there, and we lead busy lives. And the initial reaction when you say I want to take 6 weeks out of life to have an adventure and do something is, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? All reasons why you can't do something. But what I realized was that by taking each one of those things in isolation, if we could deal with them one after the other, there was the opportunity to get this done. Personal things had to be thought about and worked around. Things like, being away for Christmas is quite a big deal, but is it a bigger deal than achieving a lifetime's ambition? I decided that it wasn't. In any organization you're in, it's really easy to think that your importance is absolute, but I knew that even if I wasn't to be at work for a period of time, that there were people there who would be happy to step into my role, and actually I wouldn't be missed too badly. So by identifying all of those obstacles, by having the support of really key people around me, my family, my colleagues and friends, it meant that my absence for 6 weeks wasn't felt too keenly, and it could be done. So there was nothing to be done then other than to get started on it. And I was very, very lucky in that I had a boss who thought along the same lines as me. We chatted, we were basically match made by our friend Katie. And we ended up chatting. Do you want to do it? Yeah, I want to do it. Should we do it? Yeah. What about X, Y, and Z? Well, let's worry about that a little bit further down the track. And that was a key conversation between myself and Julian, my boss at the time. And once we'd decided to enter it and worry about the details later, we were in. We were hostages to fortune. It was going to happen. All we'd have to do then is deal with the obstacles as they arrived one after the other, and we knew that we could do that. But the hard bit was just taking that first step and getting started on it. And once we were started, the project was up and running. The team, we didn't really know each other before. As I said, Julian was my boss, but I didn't really know him very well. Ian, I knew a bit, and the other 2 guys we didn't know. So we put together a team of 5, really, for all sorts of reasons. We wanted to get across quickly, so 5 was going to be better than 1. Also, there's quite a financial angle to this as well. It's expensive to row across the Atlantic, and split 5 ways, again, it was possible, whereas taking on that level of financial exposure on your own, it certainly wouldn't have been possible for me. So we decided on a 5, and although we didn't know each other, we were able to vouch for each other. I knew Ian and vouched for his qualities as a bloke and as someone who I knew could endure 6 weeks at sea. And Julian vouched for the 2 bomb disposal lads. And although we didn't know each other well, we were able to make certain assumptions about each other's character. And we were reasonably confident going into this that we'd be okay. And it's all about the people you hang around with, whether you're at school, whether you're in a job. If you're around inspiring people, you'll be inspired and you'll have a fighting chance of inspiring other people. And I was just really lucky to find myself in the company of some brilliant people. And I got to spend 18 months planning this with them and then executing it over 6 weeks. The stories I heard about the boys whose career is in bomb disposal, whether it's in war zones like Iraq and Afghanistan, or dealing with civilian things like the Ariana Grande concert. I've heard all of those stories. I've heard all about entrepreneurism from Ian and his struggles and successes in building a brand and all that sort of stuff. So it was just an amazing time around some amazing people. And 18 months we were planning this, and for 18 months we had this project that was just above our heads somewhere, and we could dip into it whenever we wanted, and it was life-affirmingly exhilarating to have this, you know, chance of a lifetime to do something, and it was always there, and life was incredibly fulfilling for those 18 months as a result. But great people, and it all contributed to a great experience. And if you're going to spend 41 days or so on a boat with 4 other people, you've just got to be around. They've got to be people that you get on with well enough, and who you can rely on when times get tough. The picture of the lion there, actually, that was a gift from my kids' primary school. That came with us all the way to Antigua, and that was to give me courage, and that was very kind of them to do that. As I said, it's expensive. So in the 18 months, we really had to use our networks, and networking is such an important skill as well if you want to change the world, or if you just want to row across the Atlantic. We needed to raise somewhere in the region of about £110,000 to do this. And that was all achieved through our network and our, I suppose, desire to go out and basically ask people for money in return for, fairly limited amounts of exposure for their brands and things. But in terms of value for money, there probably wasn't a lot there, but there were people out there who just wanted to support people having an adventure. But the importance of network can't be overstated, because without it, we wouldn't have made it to the start line, because we just wouldn't have been able to afford it. So start building your network early on. And the charities then, the main charity we did it for was the Felix Fund on the left, which I think you might be able to find a video link to this, which tells you all about it. But basically, it's a fund that supports the families and those injured in carrying out their duties, disposing of bombs in war zones or in civilian life. That's Mrs. Nelson in the top right, the boat. She'd been across 4 times previously. And these were the crews that we inherited her from. And this is interesting as well, just in terms of delegation. Ian, my mate, he was in charge of the food, and he's very meticulous, loves spreadsheets, and he'd worked out the number of calories we needed per day per kilo of body weight, and that translated into a load of dried food that looked a bit like that. We trusted him very much on the numbers and the detail. Unfortunately, we trusted him to the point that we didn't bother checking what he'd ordered, and he'd ordered 1,100 main courses. We had no breakfast items, we had no sweet stuff, and by day 3 I was just craving custard. Neither did we have enough chocolate on board, so that was severely rationed as well, and became the nighttime treat. And this is Mrs. Nelson again. We'd get briefed before we left, and this is the start line, and all of the crews would go off in 5-minute intervals. Our sort of mantra really was stay safe, stay friends. And, it's obviously a reasonably dangerous place to be, but if you take the correct precautions, if you do the right things over and over again, you can stay safe. The boat is designed to right itself if it capsizes, and as long as you stay clipped on, a bit like at Go Ape or something, you will remain attached to the boat, and you'll be fine. If you are complacent or lazy or whatever, and you are not clipped on at the critical time when the boat capsizes, then you could find yourself in all sorts of bother. So staying safe, the one rule that we had was that you remain clipped on at all times. And then the stay friends thing, that took work. There were hundreds and hundreds of opportunities to win an argument with, I don't know, a cheap shot or a comment, and hundreds of times we managed not to do that by making the effort to ensure that we remained friends, that we kept things in perspective, and that we didn't sacrifice the ultimate goal, which was arriving as a group of friends, for the short-term prize of an argument won. And so that was really what we tried to live by on board. Yeah, hands looked like that. Sometimes it was never quite that bad. It was more the muscular repetitive injuries caused us problems. And I want to talk a little about your responsibilities on a crew like this as well, because there wasn't a lot to do. All you had to do was every 2 hours, get up, get on the oars, row for 2 hours, and then go and rest, wash, eat for 2 hours, and then get back on the oars. 2 hours on, 2 hours off, every single day for 40 odd days. And you had a real responsibility to do your best, to make sure that you were never late for a shift, because if you were late for a shift, that would impact on your mate. You had a responsibility to make their lives easier. My job, I was really keen to make sure that I brought something to the party, and I ended up being the guy who cooked the food in the morning for the whole crew, for their 3 meals each for the day. So I'd boil the water, hydrate the food, and distribute them. And I wanted to make sure that I was bringing something to the party, because in an environment like that, you just can't have passengers, and you want to contribute, so you've got to find something that you can contribute to make sure that you're worth your place on the boat. Waddy in the white cap there, he was super technical, loved knots as well, so he basically tied everything to the boat all the time. If ever anything went wrong technically, he'd be the guy to do it. But the reason I've put this slide up is because there was such a big difference between the daytime routine and the nighttime routine. Daytimes were just a joy. I mean, most of the time it did look like that, albeit that only, we wouldn't all 5 be on deck most of the time. But what's not to like about being in a boat, in some waves, crossing the Atlantic? It was absolutely wonderful during the day. At night time, however, that kind of debt, that fun debt, was repaid over and over and over again, because they were just horrendous at night, because you couldn't see the waves, you were wet, you were cold, and time just dragged. And so there was a real difference between day and night time. 12 hours of light, 12 hours of dark at that latitude as well. And you learned a lot about each other at night. And we just talked. We talked a lot about all sorts. We knew the nights were going to be bad. So in the afternoon, we'd agree what we were going to talk about in the evening. And then in the night shifts, we would just tell stories upon stories about anything. And a typical one would be, I don't know, your greatest England football 11 ever. Another one would be, I don't know, 3 cars that are important to you. And it would be, you were expected to talk for a good 30 or 40 minutes about some car that was important to you, just to pass the time. And yeah, they dragged, they were awful, and they really didn't get any better. As I said, the barriers to doing this are pretty low. You don't need to be technically particularly able. You just need to have a basic understanding of winds, currents, and waves. And that's, kind of level 1 yachting technicality. We had a friend on land who was interpreting charts like this for us and giving us a bit of a heads up over the radio. So, we were able to make some decisions based on information that someone else was interpreting. So, there was, we trusted them to give us the right call. Yeah, so navigating was fairly straightforward. The winds and the tides, they're pushing you west a lot of the time, but because we didn't look after our batteries very well, at night time often we had to go back to basics. We had to navigate by the stars. And this is actually one of the interesting things here, managing the relationship within the team. You saw the boat at the start. Obviously, it's got 2 ends to it. At the one end, you can see Ian there in amongst all our snacks. No technology there at all, no screens, no power, nothing. You can see Waddy and DJ on the right-hand side there. That's where all of the comms equipment was, all of the knowledge, all of the information was coming in there, all of the route planning, all of the decisions, all of the information required to make the decisions came into that end of the boat. And there was a real imbalance of knowledge, because I was in the end with Ian there, and we were fed a diet of information that was sometimes adequate, sometimes inadequate. The guys on the right-hand side there, they had a switch which they could turn our electric on down our end or turn it off, depending on whether we had enough electricity from the solar cells to power things. And we'd have to go cap in hand all the time to ask, can we have some power? Can we have some power? And nearly always the answer was no, because we didn't manage the batteries. well enough. And having to constantly ask for information or ask for power, it created a tension. And that was something that we had to talk about and to manage. And we had to say that, you know, this is a difficult thing to keep having to ask. Please give us some more kind of information at times. We need it. But that imbalance of knowledge, it was relatively stressful. So I think the lesson that we learned from that was just ensure that, you know, the crew are briefed all the time about the state of various things, you know, the reasons why decisions are being taken. We did collaborate a lot on decisions, but, you know, we were always receiving the information secondhand, which put us on the back foot a little bit down our end. So that was a challenge that we had to get over as a team. But the way I think we avoided it becoming a big thing is because we knew everyone was trying their best. If they weren't giving us information, it wasn't because they were being deliberately unhelpful. It was just perhaps they'd, you know, been thinking about something else. And so I think by the default posture being one of generosity and trust, we managed to, you know, avoid having a big blow up. Managing pressure over a long period. So 41 days is quite a long time, and, you know, you just repeat your 2-hour shift over and over and over again, and that's fine, but you want to get there. And I started to struggle a little bit with 600 miles to go, in that we'd done 2,400 miles, there were only 600 to go, which in the scheme of things isn't a lot, but it's still quite a long way. It was still 9 days, which is still like a decent family holiday of doing 2 hours on, 2 hours off, hating nights, which is a long time. So I concocted this kind of little golf scorecard thing just to help me have some intermediate achievements for the last 9 days. So each hole was a day, each par was 66, which is the number of miles we'd expect to do every day. And twice a day, we'd write down how far we'd gone in that 12-hour period. And that just kind of broke down what was quite a big chunk, 600 miles, into 12-hour bite-sized pieces. And, you know, if nothing else, it gave us something to do. It looked a bit like a golf scorecard, which made me happy because I love golf. But it was just a little project which helped get through. We haven't been able to get back to the boat. I did finish this, by the way, but we haven't been able to get back to the boat since we finished because of COVID, unfortunately. But we did manage to finish the scorecard. Arriving in Antigua was, as you'd expect, an emotional affair. Although the emotions weren't quite what I expected. It was exhilarating, lots of people out cheering us on. But for most of that sort of period where it became obvious that we were about to finish up, I felt a little bit sad that I wasn't going to be with these people anymore. And as exhilarated and as relieved as we were to finish, because, you know, it was hard, I knew that I'd miss them. I knew that I'd miss this thing that we'd had in our lives for 18 months. It was an incredibly special thing to do with them. And I just knew that we'd never do it again, or it's highly unlikely that we'll get to do this again as a group of people. And so I think as happy as I was to finish, equally I was very, very, very sad, actually, that it was all over. Life out there was very simple. We got it in the end. We nailed it in the end. We worked through an awful lot of stuff together, and, you know, we got to know each other really, really well, largely through talking and storytelling and everything else. And as I said at the start, we didn't know each other that well before we started. One of my regrets, if it's a regret, is, you know, I would have loved to have done something like this with my very best friends, just to really cement that relationship in life. I'm so grateful that I managed to find 4 other people to do it with. And, you know, maybe not knowing them well was an advantage in that we had to be quite careful in the way that we grew the relationship. We could take nothing for granted because we didn't know each other's backstory. You always had to be very respectful that that backstory might contain things that you didn't necessarily know about. Whereas with your family in particular, with best friends, often you can take them for granted and ride roughshod a little bit over them. We couldn't afford to do that here because there was no room for a big Barney. There was no room for a big fight on board because there would have been nowhere to go. It would have festered. It would have been horrendous. So that distance, that lack of kind of intimate friendship, I think helped us in remaining reasonably kind of professional and goal orientated, and it wasn't complicated by 20 or 30 years worth of personal life as well. So as much as it would have been lovely to have done it with my very best friends, actually doing it with some people purely with the goal in mind, I think possibly worked to our advantage there. And that was us at the end, beards and all. And I've just talked a little bit about sort of the regret that I wasn't able to share that with perhaps my best friend, but pros and cons. And I hadn't really understood closure to any serious degree. It's something I'd heard a lot, and I'd never ever felt the need for any closure. But I haven't seen these guys since we left Antigua, and I miss them, I miss it, and I think I would benefit from sitting down with them and talking about it and reminiscing and drawing a line under it as a project. And that is a regret I have, and I don't know, that's the missing piece in otherwise an adventure that I feel incredibly privileged to have had. I learned about how my mood impacts others. I learned how important it is for me to be around an optimist. Julian was my optimist. Whenever I was down in the dumps, lacking in motivation, he would invariably say something or interpret a bit of information that would make me try harder. So I don't know, it was a voyage of discovery in all sorts of ways, but ultimately just a brilliant adventure with some brilliant people, from which I learned a lot of stuff I already knew, but it was nice to see it put into practice.
All right, thank you so much. Wow, it feels like we've been on a journey as well, right from the inception, that original inspiration from the age of 8 years old. I can't imagine that conversation with the family about missing Christmas. I even more can't imagine rocking up to a boat with 11,000 main meals and no chocolate. I think that's a key takeaway here, is remember the chocolate. But there was definitely some challenges along the way. I'm sure everyone will remember that picture of those hands. But if there's anything to take away from this, it really, thank you so much for that really humble journey of, we were talking earlier to Hamzy about how every life matters, and it's so crucial. So even though, yes, this was an adventure and it was a privilege, learning to work with people on such a small basis is such a crucial skill. And it's amazing that you just saw this opportunity and went for it. I'm slightly intimidated by the thought that you said anyone can cross the Atlantic, but those 2-hour shifts on and off just sound so full on.
Yeah, and that was the hard bit. It was just the grind and the routine. And the bizarre thing was, in those little cabins, so you'd be asleep and you'd be dreaming that you were rowing. And then the awful thing would happen is you'd wake up thinking that you'd just finished your shift because you were dreaming that you were rowing. But actually the awful truth would dawn on you that you had to go and row your 2 hours. And that happened nearly every time you've had a sleep. So it was just that the first few minutes from going from being asleep to getting on the oars were just horrific, and happened every 2 hours. And that was the challenge, is can you not let your mates down on a 2-hourly basis every day for 6 weeks? And that required effort. Can you every 2 hours tidy up after yourself in the cabin to make sure you're not leaving it a mess for your mate? And it was just that, I don't know, the constancy of effort, because you knew that if you didn't make that effort, someone else would suffer for it. And
yeah, now that is endurance like I just can't understand. So thank you so much for telling us all about that. I'm afraid we are well out of time, which is a shame, because that adventure deserves a whole book. I think you can write a book next.
I think Julian has written a book, actually.
Oh, there you go. We'll link it to that later. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We at 3:45 have a panel on taking action during COVID times. I'm actually going to be on it, so that could be interesting. So we'll see you at 3:45. Cool.
Thank you.
Yeah, beautiful. Thank you so much. Thank you.